Chapter 17. John groaned slightly at the immense weight bearing down uncomfortably on his shoulders and back. He'd stripped down his rucksack and packed only the barest essentials: sleeping bag and roll mat, a week's worth of food and water, medical pack, Semtex, 10 magazines for the HK-417, and a bandolier of spare ammunition for the AA-12, plus grenades. It still added up to over 60 pounds in weight, plus his weapons. All the others were similarly laden down, and most of the others also had shovels, poles, ponchos, and camouflage netting. Cameron had taken more than her fair share of the weight and was carrying over 200 pounds on her back, including a large jerry-can full of spare water, but the weight of their equipment was still a hefty burden on each of them. Still, John thought to himself as he marched down the Metrorail tunnel alongside Cameron, it could be worse. John looked around at the others marching and noticed only he, Cameron, and Ellison weren't bleary-eyed and hanging by a thread. Mac was on point, so he couldn't see the large man's face, but he looked back at Derek and saw the bloodshot eyes, the purple circles that hollowed his cheeks, and the fact he looked even paler than he had before. Savannah marched past Derek, looking the most disheveled out of the entire group. Her red hair was an utter mess, and the bags under her eyes were twice the size of anyone else's. Heavy night, was it? John asked. I never want to drink again, she groaned weakly. I thought you said it wouldn't affect you, John smirked. To be fair, she drank twice as much as anyone else, Derek commented. He would never have believed the small red-haired girl, only a few years older than John by the looks of it, had drank the entire camp under the table, including him and Mac. She'd been the only one able to stand, if only barely, by the time the barrel had run dry. You should be dead, Cameron told Savannah. She'd tasted a sample of the moonshine in the morning, just the few drops left, and analyzed it out of curiosity. It was much stronger than any drink brewed before Judgment Day, and more than the wood alcohol John treated his soldiers to in her future, and Savannah had drank copious amounts of it. I feel dead, Savannah replied. She'd never had a hangover like this before. Her skull was being split in two by an imaginary axe that she couldn't pull out, and her mouth and throat were parched. She pulled open a canteen and put it up to her lips. She swirled the first mouthful around, wetting her tongue and gums and trying to make her mouth feel less like a desert, then spat it out on the ground. She took several long gulps before her thirst was at least somewhat quenched. It's what you get, Ellison told Savannah, stepping past Derek and matching her stride. I've told you before, nothing's without a consequence. I know, Savannah sighed. Ellison didn't press it any further. He knew the searing hangover would be lesson enough, and both of them knew it wasn't a habit of hers. She rarely touched a drop anymore, ever the wary, watchful professional, but seeing Weaver again had driven her to it. She'd needed something to make her forget, even if only for a few hours. After the others had gone to bed, things got a little blurry, and she couldn't remember leaving the party at all. She'd just woken up in the same room as John, Cameron, and Ellison, with no clue how she'd gotten there. John felt a lot better now that everyone else was hung over and looking like zombies from Night of the Living Dead. He'd slept pretty well last night and felt fresh as a daisy compared to most of the others. He looked back and saw Allison and Kyle marching together, chattering quietly between them. They both looked hungover too, though not as badly as the others. He reckoned they'd rejoined the party sometime after he'd gone to bed. Still, the group was in a terrible state. If they got attacked by machines now, they'd last barely a minute. John hung back a little and marched alongside Derek, and Cameron followed suit. Have you got the map? He asked. Derek nodded and pulled out a map of California. He handed it to John, who partially unfolded it. Cameron looked at the map, quickly located Sierra Corp's position and that of Serrano Point, took in the scale marker and made a quick calculation. 162 miles, she told them. As the crow flies, Derek replied. More like 200 going underground, until we're clear of LA County. John and Derek had gone over the plan before and agreed that Derek would lead the way through LA County. He knew the area and how to move around better underground. Where are we now? John asked, looking down at the map. He wasn't used to traveling underground like this. Coming up on Hollywood and Vine, Derek said. He took the map back and looked just to make sure. He knew the tunnels pretty well, but it never hurt to be too careful. Once we hit North Hollywood Station, there's service tunnels that lead into an old line that hasn't been used in over 50 years. It heads north to San Fernando. John looked down at the map, at where Derek's finger was pointing. We head northwest, he said, running his own index finger in up from San Fernando, northeast in a curve that ran through the Angeles National Forest, between Santa Clarita and Palmdale, before curling west towards Los Padres Forest. Derek shook his head. No, that'll add another day to the hike. Cameron looked at the map for a split second. John's right, she countered. She pointed to a small airport on the map to the west of San Fernando. Any airport left functional would be likely to house a number of HKs. Skynet tended to repurpose existing airfields, and after her and John Henry's UCAV attacks, many of the HKs from LAX and other large airports in the area would have dispersed to smaller ones to preserve Skynet's forces. She pointed to the airport on the map. John's plan is good. The route is remote. And to Cameron, remote meant safer. The chance of being seen by machine patrols in the wilderness was much less than by taking the more direct route. This mission was already extremely dangerous. She wouldn't risk John any more than was necessary. John pulled a radio out from his pocket and switched it on. He'd already matched the frequency to the one they'd left with Weaver. Weaver, come in. He spoke into it as he pressed the comm button. There was no response, not even static on the other end. Weaver. John looked at the thing and tried to work out what was wrong. Here, Cameron held out her hand for it, and John gave it to her. She pulled out a crank from the back and wound it around in circles, going faster and faster and letting out a high-pitched tearing sound. Batteries would have degraded beyond use, she said, as she handed the now fully charged radio back to John. People have to rely on wind-up radios. That's one of the biggest problems we had for years, Derek added. We had a lot of equipment, but batteries ran out, and we had to throw stuff away. Thanks, John smiled at Cameron as he switched it on again, and this time was rewarded with a faint hum. Weaver, are you there? Weaver crouched down in front of the electromagnet she and Cameron had unearthed and inspected the cover panel at the front, a few inches above the ground. The panel was a square sheet of iron, 4 inches by 6, and connected by 4 screws in each of the corners. Weaver's forefingers turned silver, elongated to twice their usual length, and grew thinner, tapering down into a tiny screwdriver head at the end. She jammed them into the screws and turned them round, twisting her arms into a coil as she worked them loose. When the first 2 screws were undone, she started on the bottom 2, and within seconds had made short work of them. Her fingers morphed back into normal shape, and she pulled the panel free, revealing a number of switched and electrical ports. Weaver had anticipated that she'd need to make alterations to the TDE, and had designed it with that in mind. The time displacement equipment she'd created was built to run on a vast amount of electricity flowing through it at once, taking advantage of the massive power infrastructure available in the past. Now she had to recalibrate circuitry and equipment to build up the power in a buffer, as Serrano Point alone was insufficient. If they operated the machine, as it was now, it would simply attempt to form a sphere, which would quickly dissipate after a few seconds without enough power to sustain it. Weaver connected a USB line into one of the ports and hooked up the other end to the laptop she'd stored inside the walls. She'd stored a number of spare batteries, so time wasn't a concern for her. She could also run the laptop off the power that would flow from Serrano Point when John and Cameron completed their mission. She started typing rapidly at the laptop's keyboard and worked quickly and diligently on reprogramming the power distribution systems. "Weaver, are you there?" She turned her head towards the radio as John's voice crackled several feet away on the ground. If she were human, she might have sighed or rolled her eyes in annoyance at the disruption to her work. She extended her arm out, stretching it across the room, and reached out for it. She brought it back towards her and pressed down on the comm button. "Yes," she said curtly. "How's the TDE going?" John asked. "Slowly," Weaver answered. "It would go much faster if I wasn't interrupted. I wanted to tell you we've set out. We're in West Hollywood now and should be out of LA County in the next 10 to 12 hours. "Very well," Weaver simply replied. She didn't understand why he needed to know her progress. She didn't need to sleep and could work continuously. She'd have completed the TDE alterations before they reached Serrano Point. "We'll be in touch," John said. A moment later, the radio went dead and pure static crackled until Weaver switched the device off and continued with her work on the laptop. She wasn't pleased by current events. Her plans had been ruined by John and Cameron, and she fully intended that the latter would continue John Henry's duties once they returned to the past. If they succeeded in eliminating John Henry's brother, then it would still be Cameron's responsibility to ensure no other AI emerged to threaten the world, and Weaver would make sure that she fulfilled her new role. She knew John Henry's capabilities, and that Cameron was capable of much more than the simple protection of one single human. She knew Cameron would object to being separated from John, but it was her intention that John Connor, the savior of the human race, would never be necessary, and Cameron would see that her mission to protect John was no longer valid. Machines like herself and Cameron were meant for much greater things. John and Cameron silently led the group through the twisted landscape of Angeles National Forest. They were spread out and all moved quickly and quietly, with barely a word being spoken and none above a low murmur. John could only describe the scenery around them as disturbing, to say the least. The forest, once a vast green wilderness, had been completely changed by Judgment Day. Miles and miles of dead trees littered the landscape as far as John could see. Greenery had been replaced by millions of dead trunks, twisted and lurching from the blast waves of Skynet's nuclear attack. Branches reached out like malevolent arms attempting to snare unfortunate victims. And most disturbing of all, John found, was the total silence of the forest. There were no birds, no animals, nothing. The forest, like most of this world he'd seen, was completely dead. "This place is the second creepiest thing I've ever seen in my life," Allison said quietly to Kyle as they passed under a large redwood leaning diagonally over them almost to the point of collapse. Its branches hung down and extended out, brushing the tops of the taller fighters' heads as they passed under the foreboding threshold. She was glad that Cassie was with her. She'd pick out any machines and hopefully give them some warning if any tin cans were nearby. "What's the first?" Kyle asked, already suspecting what her answer would be. "That," Allison pointed at Cameron up front, marching several yards in front of her. She unconsciously fingered the trigger of her assault rifle as she looked at the machine. She felt cold steel press against the back of her neck, and a shiver ran down her spine. "You talk too much," Savannah said quietly as she prodded her rifle against the back of Allison's neck, ignoring Cassie's growling at her. "And Weaver's the creepiest thing by far." "Can't argue with that," Kyle shrugged. That liquid metal had been the strangest thing he'd ever seen in his life. A machine that could change shape at will, imitate anyone or anything, form any shape, and even become part of the walls and ceiling. It was so cold even for a machine, so alien. He wouldn't have been surprised if Connor told him It came from outer space or something. It was so freakish he reckoned it would feel well at home in this nightmarish forest. "Are you always this hostile?" Allison asked Savannah as the redhead lowered her rifle from the back of her neck. "Only to people I don't trust," Savannah replied curtly. "I really don't like you," Allison breathed. She ignored Savannah and watched Kyle out of the corner of her eye, remembering the night before she couldn't help but grin a little. She'd been a little nervous, as had Kyle, but she'd enjoyed it, and they'd spent almost the whole night up together afterwards. She'd never done that with anyone but Kyle. It had been special. She looked forward to going back in time and seeing how things would go with Kyle without living in constant fear. They'd talked about it, what they'd do together when they went back. "You owe me a date, remember?" she slyly reminded Kyle. "Soon as we're back and we've got Skynet by the balls, I'll take you out to see a movie." Kyle smiled at her. Not that he remembered anything about what movies had been out in the theaters back then. "And dinner," Allison added. She had a feeling that after a lifetime of eating scraps, garbage, and rodents, she was going to get very, very fat after they got back. Kyle started to fantasize already about dinner, about eating real food for the first time in almost 2 decades. "Steak sounds good to me." "Then we can have dessert." Allison licked her lips sensually at Kyle, flashing him a mischievous grin. Kyle nodded enthusiastically. He liked the sound of that. He really couldn't wait until they were back from the future. They continued on, mostly silent for several more miles, past untold, more twisted dead trees that rose out of the ground like the hands of the dead, buried below. The mass of trees grew even thicker, denser, and before long it became impossible to move without feeling the twigs and branches scratching against their skin, clothes, and packs. To John, it felt more and more like something out of a horror movie with every step, except the monsters in this would be metal and very real. As the sun started to descend in the sky, and the already feeble light faded even further, the entire forest became covered in the looming shadows of the trees, casting jagged black patterns everywhere. Ellison marched out to the left of the group, keeping his eyes peeled for any threats from the side. He looked out into the mass of shadows being cast and blending in with the darkness from the rapidly approaching dusk, trying to make out anything that didn't belong. Anything shining, too straight or too curved, or any signs of movement. He saw something out the corner of his eye, a faint fleck of white sticking out from the base of a thick redwood tree. "I see something," he spoke out, straining his eyes in the fading light to make out what it was. He couldn't tell. John and Cameron at the front both stopped and held their flat palms out beside their heads, signaling the rest of the group to stop. "Take cover," John hissed at them. The group dispersed and set themselves up behind trees, shrugging off their packs and taking aim with their weapons as they formed a rough defensive circle, all of them facing outwards. "Cameron, Ellison, with me. Everyone else hold here." The 3 of them jogged through the trees, letting Ellison lead the way. When they were a few feet away, their view of whatever it was still blocked by the massive redwood, they slowed down and split up, Ellison taking the right side and Cameron and John to the left. They all aimed their weapons as they slowly sidestepped around the tree, ready to shoot whatever they saw if they had to. Ellison gasped as they saw what it was. John frowned and grit his teeth, and even Cameron's eyes widened slightly as all 3 of them took in the grisly sight before them. 4 skeletons lay on the ground behind the tree. Human ones, 2 adults and 2 children. John judged from the size of them, looking like they'd been there for years. A small plastic doll sat on the ground, inches away from one of the children's bony hands. The 2 juvenile corpses were covered by the older ones, their arms stretched across the smaller bodies. "They were trying to protect their children," Cameron observed. Again, she found herself identifying with these long-dead humans, dying to protect their offspring. She knelt down beside the bodies and picked up one of the children's skulls, inspecting it carefully. On its forehead was a perfectly circular hole, 2 centimeters in diameter, and she could see the ground out through the back. She turned it over and saw the back of the skull had an identical hole. The edges of both entry and exit wounds were smooth. There were no jagged fragments of bone, and there were no shards nearby. They were shot with plasma rifles, she concluded from her study. The superheated gas had melted the surrounding bone on contact, causing the edges to run smooth. The killings were too clean and precise to be human. Machines did this, she told them. Ellison shook his head at the sight of it. They might have been killed a year ago or 10. He didn't know. But it was still completely wrong. Parents and their children, a family, murdered. They weren't a threat, he said to no one in particular. Skynet sees all people as a threat, Cameron reminded him. Children grow up, fight back. She saw the look on Ellison's face and realized what she'd just said could have been wrong. Not factually wrong, because she knew she was correct, but she considered that people took particular offense to the killing of children. That's why we're going to stop Skynet, she added, placating Ellison slightly. She wouldn't have killed children. They were no threat. John looked all around, suddenly feeling very exposed despite the mass of trees all around them. He'd thought the forests would provide some cover from the machines, that they'd have stuck to the cities and left the wilderness alone, mostly. The same forestry that could give them cover could also hide machines that could be watching them right now. We should get out of here, John said to them. If machines had been through here, then it meant chances where they patrolled the forests regularly. He didn't want to get caught out if they came back. They jogged back to the rest of the group, who were waiting in silence for them. We're moving on, John told them as Cameron helped him on with his pack once more. He heaved and grunted as the strain once again returned to his back and shoulders. What was it? Mac asked as he heaved his own pack on again. The others all followed suit quickly. Bodies, Cameron told him. Killed by machines. A family, they were hunted down and slaughtered, Ellison added with distaste. Goddamn machines, Derek sighed. Let's go, John said again. He started marching forward, leading by example. Cameron fell in beside him and matched his stride. Good idea, Kyle nodded, agreeing completely. This place really freaks me out. The sooner they were out of this forest, the better, as far as he was concerned. They continued on the march again through the forest and spread themselves out so they couldn't all be taken out by a single shot. They all kept their eyes and ears that much more open now. They'd seen evidence of the machines out here. It didn't matter that it happened long ago. Chances were machines still stalked the woods, looking for people who'd fled the cities and gone into hiding. Allison watched out to the right of Kyle, keeping her M4 clutched tightly to her chest and swiveling her head, looking out for any signs of machines. She realized she'd been wrong. The forest had definitely overtaken Cameron as the creepiest thing she'd ever seen in her life, if only barely. A faint squealing sound in the distance caught Allison's attention, and her heart skipped a beat. She wished it could have stayed silent. It was eerie but still held some comfort. Noise meant something was coming. Do you hear that? Hear what? Kyle asked. He narrowed his eyes and looked around, expecting to see something approaching. I can hear something up ahead, Allison said, fear creeping into her voice. Maybe it's the Bogeman, Savannah rolled her eyes. Shut up, Derek snapped at the pair of them. If Metal was coming, Cassie would be going nuts, he reminded them. The Alsatian was still walking by Allison's side, ever watchful. I hear it too, Cameron said. Her enhanced hearing picked up the sound, and she knew instantly what it was. She increased her pace and put herself in front of John as she estimated the distance to the sound, 580 meters away. Stop! John held his hand out again, and everyone else stopped. Nobody had actually put John in charge. He'd never said he was, even to Savannah and Ellison. He was just doing what needed to be done, and they'd followed him. Since he'd promised Derek and the others the chance to go back, they'd fallen in, and somehow he'd become the de facto leader of both groups. Stand to, Derek ordered the group. They once again scattered among the trees, crouched on their knees or lay prone with weapons facing in all directions, and formed an all-round defense as he turned to John and Cameron. The only ones stood up. What's going on? John looked to Cameron, having no idea what it was either. Allison's dog stared forwards at the source of the sound, ears pricked and eyes glued straight ahead, completely alert. Skynet transports, Cameron said to both of them and pointed ahead to their half left. In the forest? John asked, confused. How the hell was that possible? He had a vision of centaurs forging a path through the woods, knocking down trees and crushing them like twigs beneath their giant tracks. If one of those things came towards them, they were screwed. He looked to Ellison, the closest of the group to them. Keep them here, he told the older man. We're gonna check it out. Together, John, Cameron, and Derek ran forwards and weaved in and out through the trees. Cameron took the lead and led them through, keeping herself in front of John in case anything appeared to attack them. Finally, they saw the trees ended at some kind of clearing. Get down, Cameron told them quietly. All three of them lay down prone on their stomachs and slowly crawled forwards towards the edge of the clearing. They kept behind the larger, thicker trees and stopped 20 meters away from the last of the trees. The forest abruptly ended, and a grass verge ran for 10 meters or so towards a multi-lane tarmac road. A few meters behind that was another tree line, where the forest began again. Large vehicles rolled down it on multiple sets of large wheels. A mammoth centaur rolled slowly at the front of the convoy. Its plasma cannons turned across wide arcs, and the machine's head swiveled left and right, searching for targets. Behind it was a vehicle that looked a lot like an armored personnel carrier. It rolled forward on 8 wheels with thick rubber tires and a turret on top with a pair of large, mean-looking plasma cannons. It towed an armored trailer as long as its own body and slightly higher behind it, mounted with a second plasma weapon that faced the opposite direction. Behind that were 3 long vehicles John guessed were carrying cargo. Large armored cabs, bristling with sensors for autonomous driving, towed gunmetal gray trailers that were at least half again the length of the largest 18-wheeler semi-trucks he'd ever seen in his life. Unlike semis, however, or any other vehicles he'd ever seen, the entire convoy ran almost silently. He didn't hear any engine noise whatsoever, only the faint squealing of tracks and tires and their crunching over the tarmac road. A second centaur brought up the rear, protecting from any threats that might attack from behind. Shit! Derek cursed in a low voice as he watched the convoy slowly trundle along, barely making 15 miles an hour by his guess. You didn't mention this, John muttered to him. I didn't know about it, Derek replied. How the hell didn't you know there was a supply route here? John asked. He turned to Cameron. You didn't know about this. Cameron shook her head slightly. I knew Route 14 was here. It's on the map. I didn't know Skynet was using it as a supply route. That was enough for John. He'd learnt not to doubt Cameron anymore. Even if he hadn't over the past few months of his life, not counting time, travel spending a day and a half holding hands with her, and letting her guide him through pitch-black tunnels underground without a single trip or stumble would have been enough on its own to instill complete trust in her. They watched and waited as the convoy rolled before them. Something exploded beneath the lead centaur with a brilliant flash and an eruption of black smoke and metal fragments as its left track was torn apart. The vehicles behind slowed to a halt, and the hatches of the armored personnel carrier opened up before it had even stopped rolling. Endoskeletons emerged out of the rear of the vehicle and from the trailer behind it. They fanned out around the sides of the convoy, encircling it in an all-round defensive formation, plasma rifles in each hand, all facing outwards as their grinning skull heads swiveled and searched for targets. "Wide," Derek explained. "There are still some guys who try to fight. They usually don't last long, though." "And you never thought about trying to join them?" John asked with accusation in his voice. He couldn't have just looked after his own this whole time. If they failed to prevent all this from happening, then he swore he'd do everything he could to give Skynet the fight of a lifetime. Not since the last guy who tried to fight Skynet got whacked. Bedell had been their best shot. He doubted this kid would have had any better ideas than the only guy known to have actually put a dent in Skynet's forces. "We need to go," Cameron told them both. They might sweep the surrounding forest. They crawled quickly and quietly away from the clearing and the road and headed back towards the rest of the group, who were still all stood to and waiting for them to come back. They all fell back into a tight cluster on John, Cameron, and Derek. Allison and Cassie were the last to come, and John instantly worried about what the dog would do with all the machines less than half a mile away. For now, Cassie was quiet, but if the tin cans approached, she would bark out and give away their position. "I need you to keep Cassie quiet," John murmured to Allison, not wanting to raise his voice. "Can you do that?" Allison nodded and knelt down to Cassie. She pulled out a muzzle from her pocket and wrapped it around the dog's mouth, but not without some protest as Cassie tried to back away. When she had it attached, she scratched the Alsatian affectionately behind her ear and wrapped her arms around her, kissing the top of her head. "Looks like you got competition, Kyle," Mac grinned. "What's going on?" Ellison asked John. "There's a road up ahead, Skynet's supply route as far as we can tell. There's a convoy on it, that's what Allison heard. One of the escorts just ran over a mine and blew its tracks off." "Stupid metal," Cooper the blonde fighter Savannah had decked sniggered. John ignored the comment and continued. "There's 20 or so endos out there, and they might come through to clear the area, so we're moving on." "Derek, map." Derek pulled out his map once more, and John looked at the curve of the road by the forest. "We're here," Cameron helpfully pointed to an exact spot on the map. "Okay," John said. "The convoy's going southwest to northeast, so we'll turn back a couple miles, head west for 5 miles, then double back, cross the road at night and away from the convoy." "Sounds like a plan." Kyle nodded as John and Cameron once again took the lead and set the pace, marching away from the clearing. Metal might show up any minute, and none of them wanted to be there if and when it did. Savannah marched just behind Derek, John, and Cameron, with Ellison next to him. Something cold and wet struck her in the eye, and she blinked irritably. She looked up, and a second fat drop of water hit her forehead, followed by even more. Rain started to fall harder and faster, growing rapidly from a trickle into a downpour, causing a soft, constant and rapid patter as the raindrops struck the ground, the dead trees all around, and fell onto the marching fighters' clothes. Savannah's jacket had been waterproof when she'd first got it, but over the years she'd had to stitch up tears and cuts, which degraded its resistance to the elements and allowed a few droplets of water to trickle in and seep through her clothes underneath. The worst part was the drops that ran down her neck, beneath the collar of her coat, and down her back, chilling her spine and causing the occasional shiver in response. "Fucking rain," she sighed irritably. "I thought you were meant to be tough." Allison glanced at her, unimpressed. "You want to find out." Savannah glared at her threateningly, locking eyes with Allison as the two stared each other down. Cassie seemed to get wind of Savannah's hostility and turned round, staring menacingly at the redhead and growling through her muzzle. Savannah rolled her eyes and broke the stare, looking away from her. The rain continued to pour down, growing thicker and heavier with each passing minute. Within an hour of the first drops falling, the group found themselves in a monsoon. Sheets of rain hammered down and reduced visibility to only a few feet in front of them. Even Cameron's vision was obscured by the constant droplets striking her eyes. She didn't have an autonomous blink reflex like the humans, so instead, she had to constantly, willfully do it. She'd never experienced rain like this before. "I think Savannah was right," Derek said as his trousers became completely soaked through and water seeped into cracks in his boots, sloshing around his feet with every step he took. "Fucking rain," he repeated her words. As if the torrential rain alone wasn't enough, ferocious winds started to tear through the forest and buffeted the squad, driving the wind almost horizontally into their faces, almost completely blinding them, howling loudly and whistling between the trees so they couldn't hear a thing either. They struggled against the wind, and the rain as their pace slowed down to almost a crawl. The trees, without any leaves, provided no shelter whatsoever. Finally, they reached a clearing, and the road came into view. John and Cameron crouched down on their knees, and the others followed suit. Cameron swept her eyes across the clearing, scanning the road on either side as far as she could see, and the tree line directly opposite for any signs of movement or any objects out of place. "It's clear," Cameron said loudly to John, having to shout to be heard above the torrential rain and the gale-force winds blowing all around them. John turned round to Derek and the others. "Me and Cameron will go first," he called out to them. "When we're on the other side, we'll turn round and cover you. Come in pairs, one at a time." He looked to the group and realized something was wrong. "Where's Mac?" John shouted out. Derek, Kyle, and Allison looked around and realized John was right. But Mac wasn't the only one. Derek did a quick count and realized that not only Mac, but Michelle, Rogers, and Everson were also missing. Kyle reached down to the radio on his vest and pushed down on the comm button. "Mac, Michelle, come in." He waited for a reply, but all he heard among the rain and wind was static. "Mac, Michelle, what's your position and situation?" Again, they had no reply. Mac had their radio. Either the weather was messing with their comms or... "Fuck!" Derek cursed. He felt himself panicking. They'd already lost so many friends, he couldn't lose any more. "We gotta go back for them." "Screw that." Savannah shot back. "We push on." "Hey," Kyle snapped, pointing a finger at her. "They're our friends. We're going back to find them." Allison, Derek, Cooper, the two other fighters, Myers and Torrance, all nodded to each other in silent agreement. "We don't leave our friends behind," Torrance said to Savannah. "Don't be stupid," she snarled. "We have no idea where the hell they are, and we can barely see 3 feet in front of our faces. How the hell are you gonna find them in this? This wasn't just a bit of wind and rain. This was a full-on fucking storm. Why don't we wait here?" Ellison suggested amicably. "They might catch up with us." John listened to the argument raging back and forth between Savannah and Derek's group. They looked ready to come to blows any second. He looked at his watch, 02:44. First light was at 6:30, and they had to be across the main supply route by then and well into the forest on the other side. With all the destruction to Skynet's facilities in LA County caused by Cameron and John Henry, he reckoned there would be a lot of traffic coming down the road towards California to repair all the damage and reinforce the ranks. It would be far safer to cross while it was still dark. "We cross over," John told them all, earning glares from Derek and the others before he decided to continue. "We'll set up camp in the tree line on the other side." He spotted half a signpost on a battered, rusting pole on the other side of the road. It was barely visible in the darkness, with sheets of rain being blown almost sideways by the wind. There, he pointed to it. 50 meters behind the tree line, past that sign. First lights at 6:30, and we're moving out at 6, with or without you. They couldn't hang around indefinitely, and if they weren't back by then, there was a good chance they never would be. You're not going to help us look? Allison asked him. John shook his head, feeling like a total bastard. We need to be across that road by first light, or we might never make it. They probably fell behind and carried on when we turned north, Cameron told Derek. Give me the map. Derek stared at her for a moment before John nodded at him, and he pulled the map out of his thigh pocket, handing it over a second later to Cameron. She stared down at the large dark green sections representing Angeles National Forest and calculated exactly where they were and where they'd turned north towards the main supply route. Cameron noticed that there were no marks on the map at all, no notes, dots, or lines drawn on it. She'd seen similar tactics employed in her future, passed down by Special Forces soldiers who'd formed the core of TechCom's Special Operations Forces and made it mandatory practice for all resistance fighters. If machines ambushed and killed a resistance fighter, they could learn nothing from looking at an unmarked map. She held it out in front of Derek and pointed to their location. Derek pulled out a small, thin cylinder of charcoal, tapered down to a point at one end, and handed it to Cameron. He then pulled out a wind-up flashlight with a red filter over the lens and shined it down onto the map so he could see. Cyborgs might be able to see in the dark, but he couldn't. Thank you, Cameron said as she took the improvised homemade charcoal pencil and drew a 3-sided square on the map. This is where we saw the convoy. She pointed at the top of the right-hand line. We turned west here. She pointed to the right angle at the bottom right of the diagram. If they fell behind and failed to change direction, then they're likely here. Cameron drew another line running west from the bottom of her diagram, then shaded in the area between it and the state road, having calculated their pace based on the speed the rest of them had been marching and increasing it by 10% to be safe. She calculated they could have traveled up to 5 miles if they'd continued traveling west rather than north. Derek frowned at the sight of the shaded area as he realized just how far Mac and the others could have gone. We'd better move fast, he told the others. You've got just over 3 hours, John told him. Derek turned to Kyle, Allison, and the others. 3 hours wasn't much time to search the area John's machine had marked out. He wasn't sure he should trust what it said, but it made sense, and he had nothing else to go on. Ditch your packs, he told them as he shrugged his own off and placed it behind a large tree, out of sight of anything that might pass by and look out from the road. They couldn't move quickly enough with them. One by one, they shed their packs, dumped them with Derek's, and took off running through the forest, away from the road. Good luck, John and Ellison both said at the same time. It took only moments for the last of Derek's men to disappear from sight, and John turned back to the road. Let's get moving, he said to them. Same as before, we cross in pairs. John and Cameron moved out first, running out from the tree line across the road, whilst Ellison and Savannah knelt at the edge of the woods with their weapons raised, ready to cover them if needed. John felt completely exposed out in the open like this, even at night, and half expected an HK to swoop down and rain plasma down on them. They ran across the lanes of the freeway, reaching the central reservation and passing through to the other side. Once they were across, John and Cameron recessed into the tree line on the other side and covered Savannah and Ellison as they followed suit. They made it across without incident and started into the forest, melting into the mass of trees until they were sure they'd be invisible from anything on the freeway. They found a spot to set their packs down, and Savannah pulled out a large sheet of waterproof canvas, sets of bungee cords, and some tent pegs. She connected hooks at the end of the cords into small metallic rings at each corner of the sheet and wrapped the lengths around 2 trees, looping it around and connecting the other hooks so the cords held fast. She then pulled the canvas taut and pushed the pegs through 2 rings in the opposite corners to the bungee cord until they were all the way into the ground. The result was a small camouflage-colored shelter, less than 18 inches high at one end and running diagonally down to the ground. The whole process had taken less than a minute, and Ellison wasn't far behind erecting his own shelter only a foot away from Savannah's and facing in the opposite direction. "Get in," Savannah told John and Cameron as Ellison finished off his own. "They're big enough for 2. John and Cameron took their packs off and shoved them into the shelter first, and followed after them, keeping their heads underneath the high end. John flattened out his roll mat and laid back on it as the rain pattered away constantly at the canvas just above their faces. John couldn't help but notice how close he and Cameron were laid together. He could feel the heat emanating from her body, even through her soaked clothes. It was a good job, he thought, that she was a cyborg. She was still dressed in the same bullet-riddled jacket and jeans she'd worn when she'd given her chip to John Henry, hardly dressed for the freezing cold of post-apocalyptic future LA. He could see the goosebumps starting to pebble up on her skin and knew if she'd been human, she'd be shivering terribly by now. Water glistened off her face and dripped off her hair, soaked through completely. She was a complete state, like a drowned rat, and yet John couldn't help but feel something stirring as their bodies touched. "Change your socks," Cameron told him. "They're fine, Cameron." "Are your feet wet?" she asked. John nodded slightly in reply. "Change them," she said. She'd seen resistance fighters who'd spent a lot of time in wet socks and boots without changing. In the unsanitary conditions of the post-Judgment Day future, many of them had suffered what human soldiers referred to as trench foot, causing sores, blisters, and in several cases tissue necrosis and gangrene. Numerous resistance fighters had lost one or both feet because they hadn't changed their socks. She wouldn't allow that to happen to John. John realized Cameron wasn't going to budge, and he knew she had a point really, and was just looking out for him. He took his boots off. He tipped them upside down and rainwater fell out, splashing onto the ground outside their shelter. He pulled his socks off and wiggled his toes, shivering as the cold air hit his naked feet. He rummaged through his rucksack and quickly found a spare pair, slipped them on over his feet and pulled his boots back on, laced them up, and then he laid back. He opened his jacket and placed his wet socks under his armpits, something he'd learnt during his jungle training. The body heat would quickly dry them, so they could be replaced when the fresh pair inevitably became wet again. John pulled his sleeping bag out, taking Cameron's cue about staying dry and warm, and slipped inside it, wrapping it around himself. He looked across and saw Savannah in her own sleeping bag, on her front with her HK-417 beside her. They didn't really need to have anyone standing guard, he knew. Cameron would be able to hear anything approaching before any of them, no matter how alert they were. "Are you cold?" Cameron asked him. "A little," John replied. Now they'd stopped moving, he was fairly chilly, but between the shelter, the sleeping bag and his cold weather waterproof jacket, he reckoned he'd be okay. Cameron unzipped the sleeping bag and maneuvered herself until she was pressed right up against John and sealed the bag again with both of them inside. She wrapped her arms and legs around him and hugged him tightly, meshing their bodies together so she could share her body heat with him. She'd moved too fast for John to react, and now he was completely stumped as to how he should as he felt himself stirring once more, hoping in vain that she wouldn't notice. "I'm not that cold," he said meekly to her. "You can't be too careful," she replied simply. She could feel his pulse and skin temperature as she held him in embrace and noticed his heartbeat had become erratic. She knew why. As they lay there together in silence, She felt his pulse steadying, lowering down until it was slightly below his normal level. She could hear the muscles of his heart beating, pumping the blood around his body, and could feel it through his chest. She liked it. She found it reassuring. A jet engine whined faintly in the distance, and John shot his eyes open at the sound, sliding his hand towards his rifle. "It's 7 miles away, flying southeast away from us," Cameron told him, able to estimate its distance, bearing and trajectory based on what she could hear. Still, John was worried. "Can't they see us if they fly over?" "They have infrared, right?" "These canvases reflect infrared," Ellison said to him. "We're invisible under these things." Well, from above at least, he thought. But Cameron could give them plenty of warning if there were any ground patrols nearby. "Good to know," John sighed as he closed his eyes again and tried to relax as much as he could, being out in the unknown wilderness with Derek and his squad out there, and half of them missing. Strangely, with Cameron snuggled up to him, he didn't find it that difficult.